Thank you everybody for joining. This is a wonderful session and I see a lot of people joining. That makes me happy. I'm Garo Batmanian. I'm the global lead for forest, landscape and biodiversity of the World Bank. And I'm also the manager of the Global Wildlife Program, which is organizing this. Thanks to Manali and Asita for organizing this. This is a way we can show also how we work together. This is co-organized with our environment, natural resources, and blue economy global practice, and the Africa and the agriculture and food global practices. And we also have a speaker from GEF who can talk about the market, etc. So this is something that it shows how we work in a collaborative way and how this kind of topic, which is related to landscape, requires a collaborative vision. We are lucky to have Susan with us, and we're going to have a session with Susan Chomba speaking, and then we have few people from different units from the bank providing comments and their own views on this, and then we open up for questions. We are lucky to have Susan. Susan is a social scientist, but she has a PhD in forest governance from University of Copenhagen. She is based in Nairobi, and in the era of people talking about planting 1 trillion trees, etc., regreening is not simply planting trees, and it's very good to see somebody explaining how regreening works. This is particularly important nowadays with the challenges we are facing in the post-COVID world, where we need to use every single piece of land we need and recover what we have to put it for better use for biodiversity and also for agriculture. So we are lucky that Susan here is going to explain what the Regreening Africa is, which is a big program with ICRAF. Then we're going to have Matthew Reddy. Matt is the private sector specialist from GEF. You think, oh, he's a guy that comes from the NGO sector, but he actually worked for the Forest Solution Groups at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and many other businesses. So he brings that business perspective into this. You know, I used to work in NGOs, and I keep saying that we are non-for-profit, but doesn't mean that we are for deficit. So it's good to have somebody talking about that part of it. Then we're going to have my colleague, Tim Brown. He's a senior natural resource management specialist. He lived many years and worked many years in Indonesia. Then he had a lot of projects in West Africa on planting, on managing, doing agroforestry. So he has a wealth of knowledge. We are lucky to have him. And then we're going to have from agriculture side an agriculture economist, Ioannis Vasileu. We work with him in several things, including how to improve resilience of our projects. Also, we are lucky to have him that he works in the commissioner under the Commission for Environment of the European Commission, and also at the UN and the climate change support team. So for the UN Secretary General. So, and also for CGR. So he has all policy and technical views for climate smart agriculture, and both Ioannis and Tim are fully involved in a program that we're starting with the GF called Food System Landscape Restoration Global Impact Program. The acronym is FOLUR, and so they also can bring that perspective from that side. With that, I hope you enjoyed the session, and I'll pass it on to Susan, and I'll turn off my camera. Susan, the screen is yours.
Go ahead, Susan. Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Brilliant. Sorry, there was a small disconnection there, but I hope it's going to be smooth from now henceforth. It's a great honor to be here. Thank you so much for this invitation. My name again is Susan Chomba. and I work with the World Agroforestry Center here in Nairobi, also called ICRAF. And on my way here, something happened, and that's COVID. And I think we are living in quite some uncertain times. But what I like to think about these times, it's also times that call us to rethink about how we bounce back post-COVID and how we continue with some of the pick up our pieces and continue with some of the activities that were already planned. And so for land restoration, this is a very critical moment. And I like to think of post-COVID as the time to build back better, to restore in a transformative way, and to build more resilient ecosystems. So it's really a great honor to be here, to be sharing perspectives from Regreening Africa. And I'd like to really, really thank the organizers of this webinar. So next slide, please. So I'm going to structure this presentation in terms of, first of all, I'll clarify what I mean by restoration, and then set a little bit of a background in terms of the urgency for restoration. Give some examples of land degradation, which I view as a flip coin or the other side of land restoration, and the drivers for land degradation. And then try to see how we link land restoration with bigger goals such as food security, climate change adaptation and mitigation, biodiversity conservation, and of course, in terms of thinking about resilience. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. I think yeah, there you go. Sorry, there was just a presentation problem, but it's back on.
Okay, brilliant. So, and in terms of resilience, we also need to think about the impact of risks such as COVID-19, that they are going to create some impact on our economy. And so how do we, catalyze job creation and bring back more resilient, ecosystems? So I'll also focus on, in terms of the perspectives from Regreening Africa, I try to structure them in a way that will make you remember them when this webinar ends. And so I'll bust some key myths, and very much drawing on what Garo just mentioned in terms of what are the key myths that we are actually seeing about regreening. And then I'd also love to share perspectives about how we measure land restoration from Regreening Africa, and what kind of partnerships are we seeing that can really scale up land restoration. And I will end with a call for a more an action learning driven kind of a partnership to inform the decade of ecosystem restoration. Next slide, please. Landscapes. So the ecosystem services have a purpose, and that purpose is, it has to do with human well-being, it has to do with biodiversity conservation, and other goals that we've been, in fact, looking forward to according to our Sustainable Development Goals. And so today I will focus a lot on restoration in agricultural landscapes, and not very much on what a lot of people, have been focusing on forest landscape restoration, especially on forest landscapes, and not as a criticism for FLR, but because we also think that there's need for attention on restoration in agricultural landscapes. And I will demonstrate why during this presentation. And I'd like to put some caveat here that restoration can be problematic when it's taken to mean a return of an ecosystem to some original pristine state, because we know that over the years, over the thousands of years, ecosystems have actually been undergoing different kind of changes. But we know that we are actually now in the era that we call the Anthropocene, where most of the changes that we are seeing in the ecosystem are actually human-induced or driven by human activity. So it's very important to remember that even as we talk about restoration. It is also problematic when restoration is taken to mean fortress conservation. And in this case, I'm referring to work of political ecologists, people like Dan Brockington, who've shown that when we concentrate too much on fortress conservation, this again excludes the human element and causes some inadvertent effects, including eviction of people from landscapes so that they can be preserved. And I think that can be a very dangerous precedent if we think of restoration in that sense. Next slide, please. So in terms of the urgency, we know very well that right now 25% of global land area is declared as degraded. I'm referring to UNCCD reports, FAO reports, affecting at least 1.5 billion people. And that's more than a seventh of the global population. In Africa, the proportion of the land that is actually degraded, especially the agricultural land, is a whopping 65%. And that puts the magnitude of the problem right in front of our face. Next slide, please. And we know very well that there have been commitments and concerted efforts towards ecosystem restoration. And in this particular case, I'm referring to the UN declaring 2021 to 2030 the decade of ecosystem restoration. That was declared 2019, around March 2019. And with this, we've seen that it has put restoration on the global agenda. But we have to take a step back and ask ourselves, how did we get here? How did we get to a point where we have massive, extensive areas of land that are degraded? And if you look actually at agriculture, the Green Revolution, starting in the 1950s, you see an exponential growth in terms of agriculture productivity, but at the same time, undermining the natural resource base, the land, the forest, the ecosystems that within which the agriculture itself is dependent on. And if you look at the IPBES report that was released last year, it is giving us an alarming message that deforestation, land degradation, habitat fragmentation, and biodiversity loss have now reached unprecedented levels, especially in the tropics. I think in the tropics, we are seeing increasing land degradation and habitat fragmentation, leading to unprecedented rates of species extinction. And so it's very, very critical to see this as an urgent issue that we need to address. And going back to the decade of ecosystem restoration, this is building on commitments that countries have made under the Bond Challenge, where 100 million hectares were promised to be restored by 2020. And even the goal expanded to 350 million hectares by 2030. Now in Africa, 100 million hectares have been promised for restoration under the Bond Challenge, under the AFR 100. Next slide, please. But the question is, how realistic are these commitments? And how far are we in terms of even making any kind of traction towards these commitments? I'd like to refer you to a paper that was published early this year by Fagan et al. That actually analyzed this global commitment vis-a-vis the land that is actually available for restoration. And some of the conclusions of this paper is that restoration commitments are generally large. And some countries have actually committed larger than their total agricultural production area. At least a third of the countries committed to restore more than 10% of their land area, with sometimes even a maximum of countries committing 80% of their total land area for restoration. Now, high rates of land cover change, we know that is still happening in tropical countries, and this may reverse even the small gains that can be made under land restoration. But above all, I think what we are seeing is very exciting and huge commitments at the global level, but very limited progress by countries at the country and local level. If you compare the progress that is being made, compared to the commitments that have been made, I think the progress right now is quite limited. Next slide, please. But I just want to clarify a little bit in terms of what we mean by land degradation. So land degradation in this photograph, in this diagram, it's not by any means conclusive, but you can look at processes of soil erosion, various forms of land pollution, poor agricultural and rangeland management, which leads to low productivity, soil compaction, soil acidification, loss of organic carbon, and of course, indiscriminate cutting down of trees. encroachment by invasive species, which is actually an indicator of land degradation. So there are many forms of land degradation that we need to be aware of, even as we are designing interventions. Next slide, please. And as we look at the various forms of land degradation, I'd also like to look at what are the drivers of land degradation. Again, this slide is not conclusive, but I try to classify those drivers into 3 categories. The socioeconomic drivers, some of what I've been mentioning there, agricultural expansion, poor cultivation practices, poor or lack of application of soil and water conservation practices, lack of income and poverty that drives, vulnerable households to cut down trees for charcoal, to cut down trees and sell firewood. Most of these indiscriminate cutting down of trees. These are really largely socioeconomic drivers. And if we look at most of the interventions that are being designed to address land degradation, they are mainly focusing on addressing those. And then we have the biophysical factors such as soil type, climate, rainfall, wind, temperature, topography. We know very well there's very little that we can do at this point to affect these factors directly, but in the long term, probably especially aspects to do with climate change. And then political economy. This is the 3rd class. The bigger global political economy drivers, the aspects that really drive global supply chains, that drive demand for agricultural products at the local level, including high consumption of things like meat and various crops that are really in demand at the global level. Aspects of infrastructure development, mining, corruption, and illegal trade. I think people who've worked in Africa for long, countries like DRC, countries like Ghana, we know very well that there are some unsustainable extraction of resources, and some of it is really, really driving and creating pressure on these ecosystems at the local level. Next slide, please. So what kind of restoration approaches do we have? Again, just to remind people, I'm focusing a lot on landscapes that are mainly agricultural landscapes, people that are shaped by people a lot. And in this diagram, you can see some of these restoration practices, agroforestry. And I'd just like to clarify a little bit about the trees, the difference between trees in agricultural landscapes vis-a-vis trees that are in forest and conserved areas. In agricultural landscape, you have more intimate relationships between trees and crops through processes of soil organic carbon, soil nitrogen fixation, trees like Fidelbia albida, increasing water infiltration, and as well as pumping water from from grounds below to where crops can reach them. We have many, many intimate relationships between trees and crops. These are not necessarily all beneficial. Sometimes there are trade-offs. And therefore, that's very, very why it's very important to think about what kind of trees we are placing in different agricultural landscapes. Then we have pasture management. We have aspects of crop management, cover crops, crop rotation. And we also have integrated pest management and soil and water conservation techniques such as zai-pits or half moons in the Sahel. So just to name a few, these are very, very critical to think about a holistic approach towards land restoration. Slide, please. Now, this slide, I took a step back and tried to think, how can we link restoration of degraded lands to the bigger goals of food security, job creation, climate change adaptation? I'd just like to point out here that the arrows actually cause causal relationships. So from degraded lands, by improving degraded lands, you're actually concentrating on improving soil health, improving soil organic carbon, decreasing soil erosion prevalence, as well as increasing vegetation, maybe through tree planting or other aspects of revegetation. And that then has an impact on climate change mitigation, especially soil organic carbon and vegetation, that we know the processes of photosynthesis and carbon capture means that you're actually sequestrating carbon and contributing to climate change mitigation. And then in terms of better soils and better vegetation, you also increase agricultural productivity. Remember my point on the role of trees in agricultural systems. And then we have tree-based value chains as a result of increased vegetation And I can point out a few, like in the Sahel, people who are familiar with the Sahel, you know trees like shea trees, moringa trees, zizifers, all that are now providing various commodities that are providing income to households, nutrition to households. And that then leads to food and nutritional security. But also commodities like shea are known to be very, very much driven by women. So it's not just job creation, it's not just about household economy, it's also gender, trees that are actually responding to gender women needs. And then we, of course, all of these contribute to climate change adaptation. Next slide, please. So with that kind of a background, I'd like to just focus on what perspectives we are learning from Regreening Africa. Of course, what I've put forward there is as a result of the different engagements and, on the ground with this project that we are trying to connect all these factors and seeing how they work. And so for Regreening Africa, Garo mentioned that this is a large scale, it's a big project that we are implementing across 8 countries in Africa. It's funded by the European Union, and we have different implementing partners. We have World Vision, we have Oxfam, we have CARE, we have CRS, we have Sahelico, and these are large international development NGOs who have the capacity and the mandate to deal with local communities in terms of development. And then we have other research organizations. One of them I'd like to point out, of course, we have ICRAF being the primary research organization, but also we have a component that is led by ELD that is co-funded by GIZ. And ELD means Economics for Land Degradation. They have their website, and I'll just briefly tell you what ELD is helping us to do in this project in the next slide, please. So we have 3 main project objectives, but our main target is to restore 1 million hectares and benefit at least 500,000 households within the 5-year time frame of the project. So it started in 2017. It's supposed to go up to September 2022. And the first primary objective that we have is to enhance the national ability of the 8 countries that are selected to be able to assess the economic costs of land degradation. And this component is the one that has been led by ELD. The big question is, why do we need to know the economic cost of land degradation? Because to be able to engage with national governments, policymakers, for them to be able to pay attention and to know this is the cost of degraded lands. And so if we don't address this, then what is the impact of land degradation on the various sectors of economy? Agriculture productivity. We know African countries are primarily dependent on agriculture, and as well as other sectors like health, gender indicators. So it's very important to set the parameters that really determine what is the economic cost of land degradation. The second objective is to equip different stakeholders in these countries with surveillance and analytic tools for land degradation, or assessing land degradation dynamics. And this is led by ICRAF. I'll be going more into this in the component for monitoring. And then the third objective is obviously to scale up and accelerate the scaling up of sustainable land management practices, including agroforestry, others call it evergreen agriculture, tree-based interventions, soil and water conservation techniques as a package to accelerate the scaling up and in order to be able to meet our goals. Next slide, please. And I'd just like to emphasize here that this partnership that we are seeing in terms of development research partners, it's a really not a common partnership. People who've been in this field for long enough know that primarily development partners, have been working traditionally, using, informed by research, yes, but not working concurrently. And research institutions, in most cases, again, work, conduct research and then produce journal articles or other knowledge materials to inform development. But working concurrently is something that we call an unusual business, an unusual partnership. Why is it unusual? It's unusual because, as I've mentioned, historically, it's not something that we've seen, but also it's really, really trying to move out of our comfort zone and try to understand and work together to be able to be innovative. And I think this kind of embedding the core learning aspects is what will help us to be able to learn quickly, adapt as a project, and to be able to accelerate development impacts. So it's really, really crucial, and I'll be again, pointing out how this is working between the partnership is working. Next slide, please. So what are the key lessons that we've learned from Regreening Africa? And of course, also widely from other programs that we are coming across, and based on the research that we've been conducting, within our various institutions. I like to put this in terms of myths. So what kind of myths are we confronting in the regreening landscape, in the restoration landscape, and how are we handling it? Next slide, please. Myth number one is that as long as we are planting millions and billions of trees, we are going to be fine. It's great, and tree planting is a really, really good cause. But we need to be aware of some key points about tree planting. First of all, tree planting is very different from tree growing, because you plant a tree, you go, you're not worried about what about the survival rates? How many of those billions of trees that we planted are actually going to survive and provide the kind of ecosystem services that we envision? So it's very important to have a long-term objective. And I'd like to refer people in this webinar to the working paper by Duguma et al., who is one of my colleagues in ICRAF, who are looking at what kind of steps need to be taken to move from just tree planting to tree growing. Secondly, about tree planting, we know that trees, it's important to think about tree species diversity, species density, because different tree species provide different functional traits. And so it's not every tree. So for instance, there are trees, fruit trees are not necessarily going to provide farmers with nitrogen fixing. And nitrogen fixing trees are not necessarily going to be very good at water infiltration or providing barriers for soil erosion. So there are different functional traits of trees, and we need to be aware what kind of ecosystem services are we restoring, and so which kind of tree species should we be going for, and in what density. Does it mean if I plant one tree in my 100 hectares that I have restored that hectare? Of course not. So there's a different elements that we need to be aware of in terms of trees. The third element is about the replacement of indigenous trees with exotics. And in most cases, if you've been to Africa, you go to countries like Kenya, countries like Rwanda, a lot of exotic tree species colonizing the landscape. And therefore, remember the point about functional traits. So depending on what kind of tree species you have, if you have one particular tree species that is very good for timber production, that's what you get. You're not necessarily going to be getting very good water cycles or nitrogen fixing from a tree that is primarily being grown for timber production. And the fourth thing about tree planting is that we need to understand that tree planting will not and should not be a replacement for cutting down greenhouse gas emissions. So even though we are seeing these huge tree drives, let it not be a distraction from the primary objective for climate change mitigation, which is actually to reduce on our greenhouse gas emissions. And last but not least is that, again, tree planting does not need to replace reduction or a focus on deforestation and forest degradation. Even in countries where we are planting trees, if the rates of deforestation and land degradation are still high, we are still losing a lot of ecosystem functions. Next slide, please. The second myth about tree planting that we are learning from Regreening Africa is that we may have an iconic practice that can restore degraded lands everywhere. So there's tendency to come up with these iconic practices. Next slide, please. And so instead of focusing on one particular iconic practice, either be it be tree planting, be it be farmer managed natural regeneration, be it be assisted natural regeneration, what we are learning from Regreening Africa is that all these practices are great, but there are different places that are suited for them. And so the whole idea about Regreening Africa, we've been learning and adapting, is to match different restoration practices to the different biophysical and socioeconomic contexts. So I'll give just a few practices here. The photo that you can see with farmers there, that's in the Sahel taken in Niger. That's soil and water conservation practice that is called the half moons. On the far right corner, that's a farmer in northern Ghana practicing farmer managed natural regeneration. So there are different practices. I've already mentioned some in my previous slides, but also what kind of strategies are we employing? So apart from the practices, what is the strategy? And so in fact, in Regreening Africa, one of the big things about restoration that we are still trying to learn is to have more gender inclusive in terms of land restoration. And so in this particular case, these are tree nurseries that are run by women groups who sell them these tree seedlings to restoration projects, restoration programs within their countries. And of course, we also have the strategy of having high value trees. Sorry, I've just lost my slide, but as it's being fixed, the mango that you saw on your far right side, that's the strategy to include high value trees, of course, for income generation and for nutrition, but also include activities that help farmers to be able to reduce the growing length of some of the indigenous trees that they like so much. So the photo there with a gentleman holding a tree seedling, that was a training on grafting of some of the indigenous trees in the Sahel. Next slide, please. So the third myth and the last myth that we like to bust about regreening is that as long as we are investing in technologies, we are fine. We are going to restore degraded land. Next slide, please. And so this slide shows more of our social governance intervention. So land restoration is eventually, it's going to be about people. Remember what I said, we are in the Anthropocene, an era where most of the ecosystem is being shaped by human activities. And so we have to capture people's aspirations, people's needs for a better livelihoods, for realizing economic benefits, but also for working that in congruent with nature. So unless we get that really, really moving within the people who are shaping these landscapes, I think it's going to be really, really difficult to see the kind of scaling up and sustainability that we are aiming for. Above the photo that you're seeing in the middle, that's one of our professors in Ethiopia talking to a group of young men in the enclosures that are very, very famous in Ethiopia for restoring degraded lands, but trying to reason with these young men. How can we make these enclosures also sustainable, but also providing some economic benefits for young people? And the photo that you're seeing on the very right-hand corner, that's a group of women we were discussing in Ghana about challenging gender norms in restoration, gender norms around tree tenure, around land tenure, and challenging these norms in a way that women can actually be able to not just be participants of the process, but also beneficiaries, ensuring that women are actually getting benefits of land restoration. Next slide, please. And so apart from that, we are working the governance. One of our key governance elements is to identify policy barriers that really limit people from taking up tree-based interventions, from taking up restoration practices. We've produced a policy brief that you're seeing on the left-hand side corner there. This one particularly focused on agroforestry policies across the 8 countries that we are working in. And then on the right-hand side corner, that's what an institution that we call the National Oversight and Coordination Committee within the project, that is actually formed in each of the countries that we are working in, bringing together people from the Ministry of Environment, Forestry Department, Agriculture Department, and even sometimes we have ministers of agriculture or ministers of forestry joining us in these meetings. And our bilateral and other stakeholders were interested as well. They join in the meetings. And what's the point of these meetings? They happen twice a year. And the primary objective is also to be able to bring the evidence and the experiences that we are getting from the ground in each of these countries, discussing with these key stakeholders, and especially for policy implications and where we need to have policy changes. And this has been an extremely productive experience in terms of negotiating aspects around land tenure, tree tenure. They are not going to happen overnight, but if these discussions are not embedded within restoration projects and they are assumed that they are too difficult or take too long, then we are not going to see sustainability of efforts. And so we can see some traction on governance elements in some of the countries that key government officials are really, really interested and are taking forth and are being at the forefront. Next slide, please. So now, after busting those key myths, I'd just like to share our perspectives on monitoring of restoration activities. Why do we do it and how do we do it? Next slide, please. So we have three main principles in terms of monitoring land restoration, that the monitoring process needs to be objective and robust as opposed to biased or subjective or weak, to ensure that whatever we are reporting is credible. Secondly, it needs to be rapid or timely, and it needs to be cost effective. This ensures that we are actually informing the implementation process and not waiting until the end of the project and then we get project endline report and the project has ended. So how do we actually inform the main project when it's happening? So we need timely and rapid monitoring process, and then being able to get actionable evidence from this process. And again, these are huge shifts that we are making even within our research teams here in ICRAF to be able to provide this kind of evidence. And then we need to have indicators that are based not just on scientific thresholds, but also on community visions. And this is another area that we are advancing within the project. And if you look at the photograph or the diagram on the right side, on the top corner there, you can see that's just a project team happily on a boat saying, why do we need to review monitoring data? Why bother? We are doing just fine. But what they can't see is that there's a deep, rapid fall that they are just about to get into. So it's very important that constantly the monitoring data and evidence is reviewed so that it informs the implementation process. Next slide, please. And the way we are doing it, we have three primary methods that we apply in Regreening Africa. We have the land degradation surveillance framework, whose guide is freely available and downloadable on the ICRAF website. It looks like the photograph you're seeing on the right. And this one, we use it for capturing soil and land health indicators. Remember, restoration is bigger than just regreening. You need to look at the soil as well as the vegetation. And then we use household surveys and focus group discussions to capture socio-economic indicators, and then data analytics coupled with remote sensing to monitor vegetation cover as well as soils. Next slide, please. Just to demonstrate some of the data analytics, these are polygons that are actually picked up during household surveys in Ghana. And then using our data analytics, we are able to provide a baseline in the different sites. So what you're seeing here are different sites in different districts in Ghana and showing what is the baseline in terms of vegetation. And you can see the very first district seems to have quite, the vegetation cover is higher than the very low, the district at the very bottom, whose vegetation cover is quite small. And next slide, please. And then we also use this kind of data to look at soil organic carbon. Again, these graphs, especially the ones at the top, these are looking at soil organic carbon in Ghana and in Mali. So I'm referring to the two at the top. And again, I indicated soil organic carbon, a very important indicator for soil, for productivity and soil health. And so with these kind of baselines, you can see these are distribution maps. And if you look at it, most of the sites in Ghana, you can see the soil organic carbon is quite low, but it's also very, very similar when you look at Mali. And then below you have soil erosion prevalence. Again, very similar distributions where you have higher soil erosion prevalence. Actually, most of it, quite above 50%. Especially in Mali, it's really, really high. And then in Ghana, it's about, in all the three districts in Ghana, you have quite similar soil erosion prevalence. So in terms of looking at restoration, we will be monitoring these indicators. And what we want to do is to see an increase in soil organic carbon and a decrease in soil erosion prevalence. Next slide, please. So we are also using other innovations in monitoring land restoration, being innovative, using Earth observation platforms and free, moderate to high resolution satellite data from space, especially through NASA Landsat 8, as well as the European Space Agency, the Sentinel program. And then we are also pushing ourselves to try and develop mobile-based applications for citizen-led science in collecting this data. And I think I'll just briefly talk about one of these applications, the Regreening Africa app that we've developed. Next slide, please. So the Regreening Africa app is co-designed by ICRAF and partners, our development partners that I mentioned. It's simple to use. It's freely downloadable on Google Play for Android systems, phones, and tablets. We've made it in French and in English. This is an app that has primarily been developed within the time frame of this project. And what's interesting is that because it is so simple to use, it is actually being used by local extension agents, project staff, lead farmers who just received some primary training. And using that, they capture what they're capturing using the mobile phones, send it, they upload it, and once they send it, ICRAF has this timely dashboard that then they're able to see what kind of data they've entered. And so if you look at the very diagram below, that's an example of the dashboard that you're able to see. It's very visually intuitive, so they can see. So this one is for Kenya, and you can see there's a lot of plots that have been recorded under FMNR, that's permanent managed natural regeneration. And the tree planting is the small green area that they've captured. And then there are quite a number of tree nurseries, at least 34 tree nurseries that they've recorded using the app. They just started using the app early this year. And so within no time, we expect that as they continue using the app, they'll be able to see which areas they are trying to restore. And we believe that this really puts power into the hands of the local extension agents, project staff, and lead farmers, because they upload the data, they've got access codes, they can be able to download this and see how many nurseries have we recorded, what hectares are under restoration under FMNR, and that kind of them feeling that they're in control and not necessarily waiting for data to be sent by ICRAF on what they're doing. Next slide, please. This is not possible without partnership. So we employ what we call the shared approach, which is a stakeholder engagement and for evidence and decision-making processes. And we use this both internally to be able to share the different evidence, either scientific findings or the kind of data that our partners are collecting and our farmers are continuously sharing with us. We share it using this structured stakeholder engagement process. But also the shared approach helps us to have other wider engagement processes, as I mentioned, using the national oversight and coordination committees with government and other interested stakeholders in those particular countries. Next slide, please. So these partnerships, I just like to emphasize, I've talked about local communities, I've talked about national and subnational governments, I've talked about research organizations, international and bilateral agencies who've gone ahead to declare 2021 to 2030 the ecosystem, the decade of ecosystem restoration. But there's a particular stakeholder that I haven't talked much about, and that's the private sector. And I think for our project, the private sector has been our weakest link in developing sustainable value chains. We have been struggling with this, and especially because we know very well that restoration is a long-term investment process. And so the question is, we really need to come up with strategies that can engage, private sector, so that, those kind of long-term gains can be able to get them to invest in the restoration process now. I think there are particular commodities in Africa, especially big commodities like cocoa, where we've seen great private sector engagement and trying to de-risk smallholder farmers. But when it comes to other commodities, especially where trees, disaggregated commodities, but that are extremely valuable for very vulnerable and poor communities like shea, moringa, the development of the private sector there in terms of ensuring that those value chains are actually sustainable and they are not leading to overexploitation of resources is something that is still not very, very well developed. So I'll be looking forward to discussions and hearing from other teams on how we can strengthen this. Next slide, please. So looking ahead, my conclusion, in terms of decade for ecosystem restoration, my proposal to you is that we need, and we urgently need, a science policy implementation platform. that brings these kind of experiences from different actors and informs the restoration process throughout the decade. Next slide, please. And I just tried to think about what kind of a structure this platform would look like. This is definitely not definitive, but what you see on the green side, on the left side, is the kind of partners that would be part of this platform: development partners, research partners, implementing partners, private sector, and other partners that my memory might have just forgotten about. And then have this platform where we have different engagement landscapes: East Africa, West Africa, Asia, Latin America. People who are working, institutions working in this place, coming together to bring experiences and share knowledge and being able to innovate on tools for transforming landscape restoration. And then having an advocacy and dissemination component that then creates wider scale adoption. Next slide, please. And just to highlight some of the GEF work that is already really looking very much that is complementary to what we are talking about, you can see the main delivery mechanisms for GEF, the biodiversity element, climate change, land degradation. These are 4 areas that I think I've already been touching around when discussing about Regreening Africa and the entire restoration process. And then I'm just going to point out a few of these projects. I'm sure there are so many programs, but I'll just point out a few of them. Just next slide, please. So for instance, the Food System Land Use and Restoration and Impact Program. Already you can see the countries that it's being implemented in, 23 countries. Most of these countries, again, we have some overlap, and there's so much that we can be able to learn and bring together into some critical learning experiences through the platform. Next slide, please. And then, of course, the Global Wildlife Program. I did mention about the IPBES report and the unprecedented rates of species extinction and the role that restoration is going to play in terms of biodiversity conservation. And if there is already a program that is already in 28 countries focusing on global biodiversity conservation, livelihoods for local people, improvement of livelihoods for local people, enhancing resilience. Again, you can see a repetition of some of the key themes that I've been talking about. So it is my conviction that having a platform where this knowledge and experiences and action learning is happening to inform the restoration decade is the way to go. Next slide, please.
Susan, sorry, so I think, yeah, okay, go ahead. This is your last slide. So just wanted to say you had 1 minute.
Yes, and thank you so much. That's very timely. So that's my last slide. I just wanted to mention that thank you so much for everybody who's tuned in. We really love to hear from institutions and partners interested in this. We have our contacts there. Please feel free to contact us, and I look forward to the next set of discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. You basically packed into one presentation about 4 different topics. It's like a whole course, and I think we're going to share this later. It's recorded so people can see it. The main messages I would like to see, and we go forward when we're going to have the discussions, is that number 1, degradation is not the same thing everywhere. There is there is no one size fits all. Everything is the same type of degradation. Degradation is different in different places, in different environments, and different biomes, and we have to take care of that. And because of that, you can't find one single solution. That is tree planting everywhere or something like that. We have to adapt to what the local conditions are. Follow the science. So that's the second message that I get from your presentation. The third one is that any solution we provide has to also deliver on or take care of climate change, biodiversity, and livelihoods. And those 3 have to work hand in hand if we want to have a long-term impact. And one overall aspect which is important, is not important on this presentation itself, but it's important. We always think that nothing we do should be an either or. You know, land restoration is not a silver bullet to solve the climate change angle of forests. You still have to protect forests, and that's why we at the bank use a landscape approach, because some places you still have to decrease deforestation and maintain the forest and use it properly, and other ones you have to restore. It's not an either or. It's not because we're doing reforestation that we can continue with the rate of land use changes of natural habitats we are having, even for other reasons related with human-wildlife conflict. And I think this is an important message came out with you. The other one, of course, that we have to follow the science and we have partnerships. Since this is a complex issue, we have to talk with climate change, biodiversity, livelihoods. We are having a social scientist explaining soil fertility and soil chemistry. So that's how it shows that we have to see this as an integrated program, and I think this was a very good message. With that, I pass on now, I think, first to Matt. Matt is our private sector specialist from the GEF to look at this from his angle. Matt, your screen is yours.
Matt, please, can you unmute?
Matt is unmuting. I just want to say that we are collecting all the comments and the questions, but giving the time, I rather have the discussants make their comments now, and then I'm gonna field the questions to the different discussants. So, but it's not being lost; it's being recorded, and we will get to them. Matt.
Thank you, Garo, and thank you, Susan, for a terrific presentation. And I think what you can't see when you're presenting is all of the comments that appear in the drop-down boxes, and I think you've excited a lot of people, and I can just imagine all of those people on the WebEx just nodding when they're listening to you, and especially for me, a lot of those myths that you highlighted particularly resonated, I think. So people know the GEF. Thank you, Susan, for putting together that nice slide that indicated our work with the impact programs. I think, you know, some of the iconic work that GEF has done over the years in partnership, of course, and people may well know us from the iconic Great Green Wall initiative. So not only in Africa, but in Asia and in Latin America, the GEF has been very active in the full gamut of restoration activities, such as we've seen today, Susan. So I'd like to then share what we would consider factors of success. So from the GEF's learnings, what are these 3 success factors that we can point to that can help mainstream the work in land restoration? So I think that's the important point. How do we mainstream these initiatives? And I think, you know, I'll start with the first one, and possibly it's the most obvious.
They said the video.
Sorry, just 1 second.
I've turned my video on, so it's probably up to the
yes, go ahead now. Sorry.
Okay, so I think this is the most obvious one. There is no silver bullet for financing land restoration. We need mixed approaches. So landholders certainly don't. When I say landholders, I include farmers and graziers. So landholders certainly don't have enough money. We know that the public purse is incredibly stretched, and so very limited resources there. The multilateral institutions, you know, it's always a challenge. And then from the private sector, as you described in your presentation, Susan, you know, how can we get the private sector to think at scale? And at the moment, we're not quite getting that level of investment that perhaps we could get, or certainly more. So we have to think much more in terms of these mixed models. So mixed financial sources and financial streams, because any one of them alone is not going to do the work. So that, again, leads us to think more about the partnerships and the partnership models that you highlighted, Susan, in your presentation. The second point is the leadership of communities, the engagement and the leadership of communities. When we think at the landscape scale, the different types of ecosystems that we're involved in restoration, we aren't going to achieve that without community-led. And you showed the reference there of the farmer-managed natural regeneration, the leadership that's involved there in communicating those ideas from farmer to farmer, landholder to landholder, from community to community. That must be led by the farmers themselves. So the leadership of communities is the second point. And the third point is the private sector. So the innovation that the private sector can provide, we always think of the money that the private sector can provide, but there are a lot of other resources that are available and can be leveraged from the private sector, recognising, of course, that the landholders, farmers and graziers themselves are the biggest private sector actors in the landscape, and they need to be suitably incentivised and with public and private partnerships. We also need supporting policies and frameworks to make that happen, and that's another crucial point. We referenced it somewhat in that discussion, and perhaps other people on the call and other speakers today will have that perspective also. So where can some of these new revenue streams come from? How can we engage a broader diversity of the private sector? So we generally think of food, timber, and non-timber products, perhaps that we can class those as traditional revenue streams. And perhaps we can be a little bit optimistic about some of the non-traditional revenue streams that we're seeing. So payments for ecosystem services, such as carbon. And one of the tenures that you mentioned in your presentation, Susan, of course, land tenure, tree tenure. And if we are going to make this happen, and it is one of those important policy points, is carbon tenure. How do we transfer and manage ownership of carbon, which of course needs to be dislocated from landscapes and trees if we are to succeed in making those investments. The other, of course, is ecotourism and the role that wildlife and sustainable management of landscapes plays in deriving private sector revenues there as well. And that's quite important, and Jeff quite active, as you know, in that space. Two examples of recent private sector successes I'd like to share. Dennis Garrity raised this one recently at the Drylands Impact Program meeting that we had with FAO in Rome, and that's the Casagal REDD Plus corridor, the RED Plus corridor, funded through carbon under a VCS scheme, and that's a couple of 100,000 hectares. So we can see, and at the same time, supporting wildlife activities, supporting sustainable livelihoods, gender equity in the process. So we can see that some of these payments for ecosystem services can be achieved at scale and can deliver broad community benefits. The second is the company CMO, based in South Africa. They've managed to create a sustainable charcoal initiative that is seeing smallholders aggregated at scale, growing sustainably produced charcoal through sustainable land management practices with very strong restoration outcomes. And that charcoal is delivering, with FSC accreditation, premium pricing to the communities. So a real additional benefit there from restoration activities for what we could call a traditional product. I'd like to leave it there, and I would like to say that let's work then, and I suppose it's part of my goal as well, is instead of making the private sector the weakest link, let's make that the strongest link. And I look forward to speaking with you, Susan, and others about making that a possibility. Thank you.
Matt, this was very useful. We also have to consider, as part of the presentation Susan made, and I expect him and Jan is going to talk about it, that private sector works better in places where you have good governance and a good enabling environment, because you have certain legality and other issues related to it. So it's always good to have that as well, and that's what we can do here. With that, team, are you ready to make your comments?
Yes, I am ready. Thanks. I didn't turn on my. I was trying to conserve bandwidth, so I didn't turn on my video. But maybe you can see me now. I'm not sure. So thank you, Susan. That was a very good and dynamic, engaging presentation. So I really appreciate it, and I agree with Garo that it brought together so many things from so many different dimensions that were good. So let me just pick up a few, and maybe build on what Matt said as well. I kind of have a couple of comments and maybe a couple of challenges, not so much questions. On the commitments that you mentioned, I thought that was an interesting angle, and that a lot of the, the commitments on land degradation, land restoration that have been made are too ambitious or over exceed what countries can actually deliver. I hadn't seen that data before, and I thought it was quite interesting. And I kind of wanted to just pose for discussion this idea that, political commitments at that level are useful for something. They're useful for galvanizing action, but they don't get at the technical level of detail. And so how do you get from the political level to the practical level? And it's good to have the ambition and the rhetoric at that level, but how can we shorten the gap between these political commitments and the actual implementation on the ground? And I think there is where Matt started to make some points, and Garo started to make some points, and we're starting to think in the Bank Green team about these sort of pathways to making a difference. And one, as Garo mentioned, governance and policy, better alignment of what the public sector is demanding, what the private sector wants to have to be able to invest more readily. And then investment and scale up is a critical piece. And I wanted to just comment on Matt's point that yes, we need multiple financing instruments and different pathways for getting money in. Public sector, private sector, we've got carbon finance, climate finance, development finance, private sector finance, and the issue there is that blending all these is actually not that easy. It's something that the World Bank does a lot, get money from GEF, get money from GCF, get money from IDA, get money from IBRD, and pull that all together into a impactful program design is not something that gets done usually at the community level. So I don't know what my recommendation is there, just to say that is a challenge for scaling up investment. Then I think Garo and others mentioned these other drivers of deforestation from other sectors, not just forest sector, not just the agriculture sector. How do you manage that? Private sector is an important angle. And then just kind of wrapping this up a little bit, this challenge that, we need country level differentiated responses. And as you said, you don't want to plant trees everywhere. You don't want to plant the same tree everywhere. You can't have a one size fits all cookie cutter approach. But at the same time, we need global mobilization of effort and resources to make a difference. So there's this kind of disconnect between some kind of global exhortation to plant trees, do better, do restoration, and the UN Decade on Restoration, is sort of sending the message in a few words, let's do restoration. But when that translates down to the local level, a president or a legislature is going to say, okay, we have to do restoration. Let's do restoration everywhere. Let's plant trees everywhere. And so, there's this disconnect between the science that says one thing and the kind of the political push to do another thing. So I just leave it there and call those challenges. I'm not sure those were particularly constructive comments, but anyway, thank you.
Team, and your video work. Thank you very much for your succinct and to the point comments. And yes, there are things we have to do together in governance and the policy side. So it was very good that you do that. Ioannis, you're up. I just want to remind you that Susan also mentioned the role that FOLUR, and since you and team work on FOLUR, maybe you want to mention that too, on how you want to see this happening.
Thank you, Garo, and thanks, Susan, for this excellent presentation. I think I'll try to perhaps emphasize on some key facts and some numbers from the agricultural perspective in specific, and then revisit some of the causes that Susan also presented, and then maybe use a specific example of one of our ongoing projects in the World Bank that addresses specifically deforestation and land degradation, just in terms of lessons learned. And then, I have some, kind of comments on specific things that they discussed and Susan mentioned as well. But starting from, from some key agricultural facts, as you will know, ongoing agricultural expansion coupled with poor agricultural productivity accounts for about 80% of global deforestation and contributes, according to different estimates, to about 30% of GHG emissions. So, another important dimension that I think we need to emphasize, especially when we're coming from an agricultural perspective, is the human impacts of large-scale landscape degradation, which are already severe and are increasing with an increasing population pressure and the growing demand for food. And I want to see this from a COVID-19 perspective as well. In the sense, we see that COVID also disrupts agricultural value chains, and poor people and farmers probably are disproportionately being affected by, this kind of disruptions in income, but also access to food. So, but also, COVID perhaps provides an opportunity for us as a development community to invest and plan also on green recovery. So, I just want to bring this dimension as well in, and, specifically as COVID is really changing the way that we're also see development, perhaps doing development in the future, how this can be taken into perspective when we design projects that they target land degradation and deforestation in the future. But going back to some of the causes that Susan summarized very well in her presentation as well, I think one key issue that we see from agriculture is the big number of factors with a diverse range of motivations and incentives that they're involved in this area. And this obviously spans from small-scale growers, traders, manufacturers, retailers, financiers, and governments as well. Susan mentioned, the particularity with practices and how there's no one size that fits all, but they have to be rather customized to the different settings. And I think this is a very important issue that we have to address as well, and we see that specifically applicable to when it comes to climate smart agriculture. I think one issue that discussants and Susan also tackled as well is the misalignment between the different incentives, and I think here it's important also to approach this from a global market and consumer preferences perspective as well. Although there is some change to internalize, some of those externalities in terms of pricing, etc. However, the pace of these changes needs to further increase quite dramatically to reach the ambitious agenda that we have here. I think Gar also mentioned and well summarized, the issue with governance. And I think from agriculture perspective, and also this is something that the full program, but also our pipeline in the World Bank is trying to address, covers three perhaps different areas of governance issues. One has to do, of course, with planning as an essential aspect of governing, and the importance of bringing the different actors together, including citizen engagement when it comes to planning to address deforestation and land degradation. The other big challenge is the multiple sectoral agencies that are involved in landscape management. Collaborating and building capacity between the agencies That's a very important aspect when we design this type of interventions. And finally, the participation and inclusion of stakeholders, especially rural communities that they tend to be marginalized and when it comes to decision making. I think that's also a good opportunity for us to perhaps highlight some of the work that is being done in the sector. One of our flagship projects from agriculture perspective as well takes place in Zambia, and this is the Zambia Integrated Forest Landscape Program. A lot of work has been already done as part of this project, but it's obvious that agricultural expansion, fuel wood extraction, and forest fires have been identified as the main drivers for deforestation and forest degradation in the project area. And these are some of the challenges that we see across the portfolio in different countries in Africa as well, and that we try to address. There has been a lot of work as part of this project, but also analytical work that tries to examine the underlying causes of deforestation and forest degradation, specifically in terms of agricultural expansion, fuel wood extraction, and forest fires. I'm not going to go into many details on that, but what I want to highlight is several success stories that they came out of this project and other projects, how to address those three areas. I think one area that is quite interesting is the provision of alternative agricultural livelihood options to address some of those challenges. Finally, maybe some other comments. I think Susan mentioned very well the importance of science and policy coming together, and I just want to highlight that as you know, agriculture at the World Bank, we have been working for many years together with the CGIAR in many of our projects, but also recently in the past UN summit in 2019, as part of the General Assembly, President Malpass also announced a further increase to the CGIAR, specifically to address some of those climate change concerns, both from an adaptation but also mitigation side. And finally, just to re-emphasize Garo's comment on approaching land degradation and deforestation from with a focus on climate change, both in terms of building resilience, but also in terms of mitigating climate change. Thank you. Over to you, Garo and Manali.
Thank you, Anis. Very comprehensive explanation of what we're doing. I see that the chat is almost becoming a separate session. Very interesting. People also sharing sources of information and ideas, offering to partner. That's very good. I'm going to try to focus some of the questions, and I ask for quick, short answers because we don't have much time left. The first one is COVID related. How has the COVID outbreak affected the development of these initiatives? And are you changing your sustainability strategies to ensure that the planting and survival rates amid COVID-19? And the other question, which is related to this, is that one of the things we have to do in light of COVID is stop deforestation. So basically, you have to keep forests there. So would that affect the idea that if we stop promoting agroforestry, will that go against the logic of closing down unitary forest heavy for forest's sake, let's say, the forest cover, natural cover, not agroforestry, where you still have people going there? Is that an issue as well? So those three are related to COVID. And I think, Susan, if you can quickly answer that one.
Thank you, Garo. Definitely, COVID is affecting, a lot of initiatives and a lot of activities. We know some, with the declarations on lockdowns across most countries, aspects of restriction of number of participants that engage in a meeting. It means most of our community mobilization activities, most of our project staff, especially who live in urban areas, are not able to move to the rural areas because most governments across Africa have put, restrictions in terms of movement to those areas. So there is, of course, a big effect in terms of implementation, especially with field-related activities. But this is where innovation and the fact that we can have these kind of meetings over webinars is really, really important. In fact, I've just finished going through each of the countries. We've been having country level meetings to restructure our activities. And just to be quick, Garo, is to mention that one of the key pathways that now we are transitioning towards is the use especially of radio communication and mobile phones to continue targeting, the messages on restoration. It's not the same as when field staff are really engaging with communities in the field, but the fact that we can still continue with messaging and monitoring some of these activities using the WhatsApp groups that we formed is a real good development from our side. So I think briefly that's what I can say. We are restructuring activities and trying to see how we can continue. But I think the key thing is to think about the long term and how we can be able to now use this opportunity, what we are learning through COVID-19, to make sure that communities understand these linkages between the risks that we are experiencing and the environment and habitat fragmentation. So that's just my quick interception.
Okay, there is another one related now with the work you're doing, and I also have a question which is a follow-up to that one. It's not only COVID, but it's climate change related. We talk about a lot of climate change, planting trees as a mitigation, but my question to you, whether the strategy should not take into consideration the scenarios of climate change. If we are planting trees or we are promoting agroforestry, 20 years from now, that area is going to completely look different. Well, it will look different than now, and maybe it's not very good for the survival of the trees that we are, or the assemblage of species we are prescribing now. So do you have a view on that? Is something you're taking? This is something we are looking on. The bank is looking into how to do this, but it will be good to see if you have that in your strategy as well.
Brilliant. Again, I think we need to be humble enough to agree that and accept that there are so many unknowns and areas that we need to conduct research on. And I know that our teams in ICRAF, there is a scientist called Roland Kint who's been looking at the different scenarios in terms of climate scenarios, projections of climate scenarios, and looking at what kind of tree species would be suited in different areas. Some of these findings are actually rather drastic. When you see that in the event the climate scenario goes in a certain way, then some tree species may not actually be able to survive in that context. So again,
okay.
People who are interested.
Thank you, Susan.
Yeah.
Okay. We have questions about participation and the bottom-up approach, let's say. Policy decisions are rarely driven only by scientific evidence and the experience of the writer. It is also important to work with and mobilize support civil society and other partners in the country. And that's true. You have to involve the people, otherwise the government won't do it. But in your presentation, it's not clear how to, if you do encourage participatory planning and participatory monitoring, also whether you are involving in your platforms and the list of partners does not include farmers, producers, organizations, community associations. So how do you involve? Are you involving them? And if you are, how are you doing that?
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't fit the entire landscape of partners that we are working with. And I'm sure some of them are actually listening in here. We are definitely working with farmer groups, producer organizations. And I think the question about civil society, that's one that we haven't engaged a lot, because civil society is a lot coming when it comes to policy discourses and trying to really get shifts in terms of policy. And as I just shown, we are just doing our analysis in terms of what are the key policy barriers in most of these countries. And I think if we need to actually change those policies, definitely by all means, it will be important to look at which are the groups in these countries that work closely with governments in terms of environmental policy changes. So farmer groups, producer groups, those are our primary actually entry points.
Okay, thank you. The other one has to do with the policy side of it, right? What are we doing on policy and governance, and how do you see this going on? This is one of the main challenges, how to engage governments, not to overpromise, but also to deliver, how to get managers or makers to, the word here is called marry conservation and sustainable use objectives, while communities can significantly improve their livelihoods. And I'll bring that into the issue of COVID, because one of the things we are seeing in the field is that people are struggling to make a living, and they are discussing a lot of social support. And one of the challenges we're seeing in the social safety nets tends to go more for urban people and not for the rural people. And then there is a drive from the policymakers to come with quick solutions so that you can reopen the economy or improve livelihoods, but they are not necessarily good in the long term. You may expand areas of plantation, or you plant fast-growing trees, but they are not the right ones for restoration and so on. So how you engage in decision-making in this in the conservation and sustainable development in tandem, and now how we do that with the added challenge of COVID?
Well, that's a very good question, and I would also, invite my co-discussants, Matthew, Timothy. If you have any points in what I'm trying to say, kindly, feel free, and Ioannis, feel free to contribute as well. I would say from our perspective, especially engagement with decision makers, as I did highlight, especially, we look at what are the key policy barriers that are really, relevant for restoration, because the policy environment can be quite diverse. And sometimes, and of course, these things, again, are interrelated. So, policies around climate change, around agricultural sector, they are all interrelated. But it's finding the entry points, and there's, again, different countries operate differently. And so it's finding the entry points that we can be able to engage. And mostly, as I mentioned, we have this National Oversight and Coordination Committee that is actually comprised of senior government, representatives from relevant ministries. And those are our primary entry point, as well as national research institutes and universities that really know the national context that we need to engage in terms of policy making. So I'd just point out, like, for instance, in Ethiopia now we have the agroforestry policy and agroforestry platform that is in the process of being developed, as well as in Rwanda. And this is trying to link the platform. It just does not focus on agroforestry. It also focuses on other related sectors, environment, health, and that platform then brings different stakeholders together. Sorry, in that country, to try and see what are the key areas that we need. Either we need to change the policies that exist, or we need new policies where we have insufficient policies, or we need to actually ensure policy is being implemented. So in some countries, we realize that there are numerous policies. The problem is the implementation process itself. And so you have to see the different levels of engagements, and also realize that policy does not necessarily mean formal policy. Sometimes in countries like Ethiopia, we've seen, engagement at the local level of what we call bylaws on grazing land management, in the of women involvement, of youth involvement, that are really, really, proving to be useful for restoration. And Garo, I don't think I got the question of COVID with policy, kindly, if you may.
Well, that's okay. I was just saying that what we are seeing, that people, the countries want to restart very quickly, and sometimes they are proposing things that in the long term are not very good, but it seems to make a short-term back. So you may plant a fresh going tree because you can make money a lot faster on that one, but then that's not the right species to keep it in an area for the long term. And so you're basically sacrificing the future for short term now, especially in rural areas, which tend to be overlooked when we're talking about social safety net. But that's okay. Let's move on. Unless Kim, Mark, or Ioannis wants to make any comments, or we can move on. Okay. If we don't, I have a question that I'm actually gonna do a little bit different. There is a question about ODA, whether we can do ODA. Is the ODA decreasing? ODA is not decreasing, and I think the best way of answering that question, if I can ask Bernard Krabbe from European Commission, who wants to make a collaboration to ask that question, is ODA decreasing for restoration and overall climate and biodiversity? So Bernard, thank you. You asked to speak, and so if you can answer that question as well.
Yes, Garo, thank you very much. Thank you. I hope you can hear me. I would say no, I am quite confident that ODA remains available to finance this kind of initiative. You might know that the EU has adopted 8 months ago the European Green Deal, which is the flagship policy of the new Commission. And of course, there has been discussion after the COVID epidemics surged on whether this would distract attention from the ambition of the Green Deal. The good thing is that the Commission has reaffirmed very strongly its commitment, and our President, Ursula von der Leyen, has clearly said repeatedly that the Green Deal will be the EU compass for a green recovery. So we really want to put climate, environmental sustainability at the heart of this recovery effort. And of course, land for that is critical. We all know that land is at the crossroads of so many agendas. So again, confident on that side. I would like to say as well that the EU is a very proud supporter of this wonderful initiative. And I take the opportunity to congratulate all the team. It's much more than a project. It's really a movement. You have heard it involves a lot of partners in the 8 countries that are involved in the initiative. It's financed by the EU, but we would be very keen to see others joining this wonderful initiative, because the ambition is high. We need to join forces, and that's only the start. So that's an invitation, and we are very keen to discuss with you on the side of the bank and on the side of the GEF on how we can make this happen. Maybe allow me just to mention a few features why we really like this initiative and think it can make a difference. First, it is not reinventing the wheel. In each country, we are looking at what works, and there are many successful cases of land restoration. So we are not bringing in drones, as Susan was saying, but really looking at what works, looking at what the bottlenecks are for scaling up this, and not reinventing the wheel again. The other aspect is that we have implementing partners that have proven track records on these questions and that have boots on the ground. That's very important. They are very close to communities, and all this work, of course, is community-based. It's not drones planting trees, but it's farmers and communities doing this and doing farmer-managed natural regeneration. So that's the other aspect. And of course, there is the very important link with policies. In many places, there are policy or regulatory bottlenecks that make that this is not happening at scale. So we need to work on policies. If we want to scale this up, we need to integrate these good practices into mainstream policies and mainstream investments. So that's another very important dimension of this work. And finally, it's not only about technologies, it's about governance. A lot is about governance and social work, as Susan rightly highlighted. In many cases, it's about adopting and applying bylaws to manage livestock better or to do this kind of things. And that's where the program is successful as well. So again, very keen to
Bernard, we have to wrap it up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bernard. We have to wrap it up. Susan, you have the final word. Do you want to say something? I mean, I think Bernard did a very good summary of what you're doing and the differences, but please, you have the final word.
Absolutely, Garo. My final word is to just thank, first of all, the bank and GEF and partners for organizing this webinar. I'd like to thank our Regreening Africa partners so much. As Bernard has mentioned, this has taken tremendous effort to put this together, and we shall continue to do this. And just to everybody to say, my final words is, let's build back better. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. I see Carol waving. Good. She seems happy. Thank you, everyone, for this. This is, of course, is a topic that's not going to be exhausted here. We have other venues to discuss this as well. So I see this as a start, not an end. Thank you, Mark, team, and Yannis for your insight as well. Have a good day, everyone. Be safe.